Welcome to the ICA. I'm Monica Garza. I'm the Charlotte Wagner Director of Education here at the ICA. And tonight we celebrate the history, community, and creativity behind a monumental exhibition with an equally monumental title, Say It Loud, AAMARP, 1977 to now. Our three guests for this program will be sharing more about their own experiences with the African American Master Artist in Residence program. However, with an exhibition that includes 39 artists, we hope you will also get a chance to meet other AAMARP creatives that are probably in our audience tonight. During the community reception, please introduce yourself. And that'll happen right after the speaking portion of this evening, and it'll be happening right behind this curtain. But for now, let me briefly introduce you to our speakers. And I gotta say, I had to condense their bios, highly accomplished individuals. Lamerchi Frazier is an AAMARP multimedia visual activist, a public artist, historian, educator, and poet. Her innovative art joyously utilizes visual media, holograms, textile language as design elements to create restorative narratives that confront slavery and transatlantic dislocation. Her textile integrations reclaim the lives and legacies of history's missing people. Frazier is Executive Director of Strategic Planning for Spoke Arts, Inc., a lifelong member of the Women of Color Quilters Network, and currently an MIT MLK visiting professor and scholar in the Department of Urban Planning. She is a Brother Thomas Fellow, a 2025-26 Arts Fellow from the Wagner Foundation, and she has bridged communities and global residencies in Africa, Brazil, Taiwan, Cuba, Costa Rica, and beyond. Frazier was recently featured in the PBS series Craft in America as well. Her art is in the permanent collections of the White House, the Smithsonian, the Museum of Art and Design, Dallas Museum of Art, Peabody Essex Museum, and the Minneapolis Institute of Art. Told you, pretty accomplished individuals. Aside from her artistic achievements, her civic leadership includes an appointment to the City of Boston Reparations Task Force, a gubernatorial appointment to the State of Massachusetts Arts Commission, and the Senate Art Committee. So, welcome. Dr. Reginald Jackson is a visual artist, community worker, and scholar, and lives between Ghana, Vermont, and Boston. He is Professor Emeritus of Communications at Simmons University. Dr. Jackson is founder and president of Olaleye Communications, Inc., a nonprofit organization formed in 1987 to document, inform, and provide consultation and research pertaining to the visual and cultural dimensions of the global African diaspora. Jackson participates in a number of community organizations that promote civic engagement and economic and social development on both sides of the Atlantic. He has traveled throughout Africa, US, Caribbean, South America, Europe, conducting visual research while documenting cultural traditions in diverse spaces through tens of thousands of photographs, which he has exhibited at institutions such as the Yale University Art Gallery, Boston Athenaeum, the Studio Museum in Harlem, Library of Congress, National Center of Afro-American Artists, and Amherst College as well. Over the years, Jackson has received numerous fellowship awards, including from Fulbright, Ford Foundation, Smithsonian, MIT, and UMass Boston. He is currently director of AAMARP at Northeastern University. So welcome, Reginald. Shea Justice grew up in Roxbury, where he developed a passion for art from watching Drawing from Nature with Captain Bob Caudle and reading comic books as a child. I actually had to Google that. After attending Boston University, where he studied art education, he taught in Florida and later at BPS. He subsequently completed his graduate studies at the Art Institute of Boston at Lesley University. Shea prefers to work on editorial illustrations and political imagery. He gains inspiration from a variety of sources, including the art of Sue Coe, Dana Chandler, Thomas Nast, and the pop art movement. In addition to research and studying American history, Shea gains ideas from his experiences attending Comic-Con and traveling to other countries with a sketchbook in tow. Shea's recent work incorporates replicas of historical documents whose surfaces are then altered through text, imagery, and more. In doing so, his art illustrates how these historical documents and what they aim to achieve have yet to be realized, particularly as it relates to people of color. Shea has participated in exhibitions throughout the Boston area and has worked permanently displayed at the Sudbury Public Library and Grove Hall Library. He is currently a teacher at Lincoln Sudbury Regional High School and a member of AAMARP for the last 20 years. Our three guests will be joined by my colleague, Jeffrey DeBlois, ICA's Mannion Family Curator and organizer of the Say It Loud exhibition.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight, and thanks to our public media sponsor, GBH, for that clip, which allowed Dana to be in the room with us tonight, and for the many other beautiful clips that they allowed us to use in the exhibition, which I'm incredibly grateful for. If you've seen a talk that I've given before, you know that I'm going to just give a copious amount of thanks, and there's many people to thank, but I'm going to try to move really quickly through this portion of the evening. But the project was a really monumental undertaking and years of really extensive research with deep collaboration. So I wanted to thank Nora Burnett-Abrams, our Ellen Matilda Poss director, for coming on board and for supporting the project wholeheartedly, and our former Ellen Matilda Poss director, Jill Medvedow, for her pioneering support in the early days of planning the exhibition, and my dear colleague, Ruth Erickson, who's the Barbara Lee Chief Curator, who I've worked with for more than 10 years now, who saw the spark in my eye when I started to talk about AAMARP, and was the one that helped me make it happen in many ways at a high level. I owe everything in some ways to Megan Claire Considine, my terrific colleague, who's a curatorial assistant and who worked closely with me on the exhibition, and just like me, shared the same enthusiasm for this group of artists and this history that we were able to capture in the exhibition. I'd like to really quickly thank our exhibitions team, Melissa Lotery and Liv Beal, our registrars, Emma Blades and Janet Moore, preparators Tim Obitz and Charlie Kroll, all the art handlers who installed the exhibition and helped make it look as beautiful as it does, and another dear colleague, Angela Torchio, for her help making the design pop like she can only do herself. And I'm really incredibly grateful to all of the AAMARP artists past and present who were so generous with me, all of you all, folks no longer affiliated with the program, all of them with really profound memories that ultimately helped shape the exhibition. And I'll say there's a list here, and some of these folks are here in the room with us tonight, so like Monica said, I hope you'll say hi, tell them that you appreciate their work in the same way that I do after the talk tonight. So, last June, Dana C. Chandler, the path-breaking artist, educator, and activist who is the founder and heart of AAMARP for several decades, passed away. And he and I had been working closely for a long time on every aspect of planning the exhibition. And something that I'll always remember is the first time I talked to Dana about the idea of doing the exhibition, I said, Dana, what do you think about doing an AAMARP show? And he said, hurry up and do it. And if you know Dana at all, you can recognize that sense of wit and that sense of urgency, which is the kind of urgency with which he approached everything, which is why AAMARP happened to begin in the first place, because of his steadfastness, his outspoken capacity to bring people along with his vision. And his support really lent the project the energy that it needed to make it what it is. I'm extremely grateful, and for that reason, we dedicated the exhibition to him when it opened just in February. So I want to begin tonight with Dana as a kind of inflection point, and all of you have really unique stories and unique relationships with Dana. So Reggie, I wanted to start with you. You took this beautiful image of Dana around 1976, right before AAMARP began. So I wanted to kind of ask you to set the scene for us, like paint a picture of the early days of AAMARP. What was it like? What did it mean to the community to have this space that didn't really otherwise exist essentially anywhere?
Well, Jeff, I would first like to say that I'm just overwhelmed with the capacity of the ICA and the staff and so forth in pulling this off. When you first came to us, we were thinking, well, here we go. What's this going to be like? And to what extent we could truly feel that we're represented properly in Boston. And as time went on, we began to realize that this was a lot deeper than we thought, and that the due diligence and your perseverance and the ability to be backed up by staff and the rest of the institution is really phenomenal. So I just wanted to say that little piece in front of everyone.
Thank
you. Well, early on, I should say that I met Dana in 1970, August 1970, in Accra, Ghana. He had just been published in the Time magazine, and really was quite impressed and in awe at this individual coming down the road in one of the neighborhoods in Accra, and didn't think much beyond that. And within 4 years, I found myself in Boston from the State University of New York at Stony Brook, and in the company of Dana Chandler at Simmons College then, but university now. And so I was there at the very beginning. Dana's studio had been ransacked. I heard that Dana had felt that there was a need to engage an institution to be able to, on Northeastern University, to be able to find a place to do his work. And I had been involved with the African American Institute at Northeastern, being asked to produce some murals for the African American Institute that Stolen Lee had redesigned. And so I had some familiarity, but had no real sense of how deep that relationship would be later on. And as Dana was able to find space at 11 Leon Street here in Boston, I could see that the excitement, the hope that something could evolve from his ability to be able to garner a whole floor of a factory building, and that, of course, he said, well, I'll take half, and let's try to subdivide the other half into studios. And it was phenomenal that Dana was able to convince and engage the administration, namely Ken Ryder, who was president at that time at Northeastern, to get this going in a way that would last for next year will be a half century. Mm-hmm. So the energy, the ability to bring folk from all walks of life into the space at 11 Leon was just phenomenal. Anybody that came to town, Max Roach, any of the poets, Sonia Sanchez and various other, for anybody that came to Boston had to hear about AAMARP and had to come and to be a part of the celebration of the artists and the art that was being produced in that space. So it was a very dynamic period. It was a very interesting time for me coming to Boston and thinking, oh, well, I'll be here for a couple of years and go back to New York. And here I sit a few decades later. The students that I taught at Simmons, every semester they had the opportunity to come to AAMARP, and I would throw a end of the year party for them. We'd do our credit and so forth and so on, but it was something that was really looked forward to, by the students at Simmons. And so as we went down that road at 11 Leon, eventually Northeastern decided that it was going to renovate 11 Leon, and we moved to a building on Huntington Avenue at Wentworth, and from there back to 11 Leon that had been renovated. And so that was kind of my trajectory with Dana. But Dana was a huge force in the art world, in that he was connected with the National Conference of Artists. Which is an organization which is probably at the time was the oldest continuing meeting annually organization of African American artists in the country. And so every Easter vacation, we were in a different city, Dallas, Pomona, California, various other cities. And I had the opportunity to connect with those artists. And they all knew Dana, and they all felt that he was, I guess I hadn't really thought about it in this manner before, but probably a step further from the Renaissance that had happened in the earlier years in New York, in Harlem.
That's great. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And then, Lamerci, like as we heard as part of your bio, you really do conceive of yourself as a public historian, and so much of your work reflects that too. So I wanted to maybe have you take a step back and tell us about where you see AAMARP, which, as Reggie said, has almost been around for 50 years now, where you see the program in a kind of longer history of Black-run collective movements towards liberation.
Okay. Well, thank you for that question. I just wanted to take a moment, if I may, to honor our ancestors. Dana Chandler, Napoleon Jones Henderson, and Candelaria Silva. If we can just take 1 second of silence for them. May they rest in peace.
Shea.
Shea. In terms of the history that dates back in New England, after the arrival of the Africans on the shores in Boston's harbor, they arrived really rich and full, with artistic talent, creative abilities. And so I like to go back to that as our anchor in terms of the mainland of Africa, being that continent that gives us the great societies. And following that line of history, as we go forward, we come into contact with artists like Cypriot Moorhead, who does the etching of Phyllis Wheatley, 1773. We go ahead to, and I can't mention all of them, so please forgive me if I leave people out, but Edmonia Lewis, who has fashioned many marble sculptures when women were not supposed to be sculpting, Meadoward Fuller. And we come across one who is really honored, Edward Mitchell Bannister, and his prize taken away because of his race identification. And that leads us to think about how a Black aesthetic is becoming necessary. And so with that, looking at the work of Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois, who is confronting the theories of Locke and Jefferson with the diminishing and marginalization of Black people and their depiction of those who are African descended as being less than, as being diminished. As he confronts that theory, it becomes a whole movement around the resurrection and the reclaim of space for African identity. And art is a participator. Art is a medium by which these discussions begin to take place. And so as we look at the opportunity to see how Alain Locke and his philosophy of what begins the Harlem Renaissance, the New Negro, we begin to see collectives beginning to form, a collective identity being able to advance the race culturally, artistically, and rise above what has been historically oppressed down. So as that pressing is going up this way, you see the need for artists who are writers, artists who are painters, artists who are theater artists coming together. And those groupings, we begin with the Talented Tenth, we then go on to, during the Harlem Renaissance, look at the creation of organizations like Spiral under Romy Bearden that has Gwendolyn Brooks, Margaret Burnham, Norman Lewis, participating with each other to make this advance a collective, not only a responsibility of the individual artists, but a mission. And with that, we can advance to Obasi and Wiusi in New York and Afro-Cobra as these organizations that are going to take on the responsibility and mission of making Black art accessible, making it a very special commodity, if you will. It is Elizabeth Catlett who urges, through that National Conference of Artists that Reggie just mentioned, she urged the attendants at that conference to realize that mainstream museums, galleries, and other avenues of Western art were not going to hail the work of Black creators. And she admonished that group to create your own. And so I think Dana heard her. I told that long story to get to the shoulders of the giants that we rest on with purpose of bringing together the voice that is loud, the voice that is collective, and participating in this movement to be able to lift up the race with other systems in place that refute colonialism and tie us into even what happened in the last 48 hours or so at the UN, that this claim of the uplift of African descended people that have been cast into slavery as their descendancy, as their anchor for realizing the might of unity, the might of looking at what is the banner of stripping yourself from what had become the labels by Kant, philosopher of white supremacy, the opportunity to take oneself into the direction of being totally recognized as human is what the Black aesthetic, I believe, was established to do. And so to participate, and it was like a dream for me to be in AAMARP. I was invited in by Susan Thompson and Gloretta Baines and Dana Chandler, and I had a very small studio in the space. It was about 9 by 12 as a room, and I had received a large commission from the city of Boston to do this kinetic work that was a 20-foot sculpture. Okay, so I began to work in the lobby, the gallery space of the 3rd floor. And one day Dana passed by and he said, so what you up to? In his encouraging way. And I told him that I ran out of space inside the studio, so I had to come out here. I'm so sorry that I have to block the way, but I can't do this otherwise. He said, well, that's what I'm talking about. That's what should be happening. So he was that kind of influence. He was that kind of person who would encourage you to go forward. He believed in big ideas, which AAMARP participates in as a diasporic institution, as a global presence. And so I really thank all of those who I can stand on the shoulders of and have also the camaraderie, the company of the AAMARP artists as a collective, so that we can, bounce ideas off of each other. And I think Dana saw that as our way to uplift ourselves. So in terms of where my mentors in this body rest, they rest with those who I saw in catalogs and could only experience them through very special catalogs like the Black Legacy, the Legacy of African American Art, in books that I had no inkling that I would be able to meet some of these people like we had on the screen a few minutes ago, like Tyrone Jeter, Norman Lewis, Nelson Stevens, Renee Stout, these icons of art that had not been necessarily recognized with its due and credit in the Western world. So I think I'm answering your question.
You are.
I at least hope so. But this history, as we march forward into the future, is extremely important and critical to understand that we didn't do this by ourselves. We did not come to this point without ancestors guiding us and without the work of many, many people. And I compliment the ICA for its pivot to recognize the global community, but then have this very focused position on bringing in local and national diverse talent in its body. Because prior to this, as I sat on an advisory board here in the ICA, making the plea for this to be a museum that represents its community that it lives in, this is definitely an accomplishment for the ICA.
Shea, I wanted to pick up this question of Dana's influence because I know you've spoken really beautifully about what it meant for you to be, walking to school and to pass by murals like this one, Knowledge is Power, Stay in School, that Dana painted in '72. That's sadly not there any longer. And I really, I know you have your own rich history with Dana, and you, I think, in some ways more than any of the other folks in the program, I see your work really picking up the kind of historical consciousness and the kind of social barometer that was so present in Dana's work. So I wondered if you could kind of rehash some of that in terms of Dana's influence on your own work and what it meant for you to then become involved in the program.
Okay. First of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor and a blessing to be here and to be with the audience. I got to start with that. I'm on cloud 9 listening to this. If I were going to start talking about Dana's influence, I got to go way back to the 70s. When I was a kid, there was this mural and there was another one. I grew up in Grove Hall over on Blue Hill Avenue, and before it was called the Mecca. It used to be a daycare center my little brother went to, a bar next to it, a karate school just down the street, and he had another mural there. So when my dad used to take me and my brother Sean to the movies, we would, or to school, we would see these murals. And for me, I got into comic books. when you mentioned earlier about people to give respect to who've passed, I cannot do this without mentioning Rob Stowe. Because Rob Stowe, you all know, he basically lived the dream that so many of us did. He got to work with Marvel in DC. He got to be an illustrator. He was into graffiti, a lot of the things that a lot of us kids were doing at the time. So when I first saw this mural when I was a kid, since I was into comic books, I thought the man on the left was like a superhero and these people had all these powers and all these things, and because the colors are bright like Spider-Man or Superman's costume. So when I'm a little kid seeing it, after watching the Super Friends, that's what I was thinking. And then I get into conversations with older people and say, you always looking at that thing on the wall. It's this, that, and the other. And look, it's showing strength and intelligence, and older people would tell me this. The mural in Grove Hall that Dana had done, he had a person who had a shirt off, muscular, with tools on his fingers, almost like a Wolverine superhero or what have you. And so when you're an impressionable kid, your first interpretation is power, strength, heroics. So I loved the mural. I thought it was so wonderful and so special. It was right around the corner from Nubian Notions. I'm sure a lot of us remember Nubian Notions. So going there and seeing all these things that represented us in the 70s when I was a kid, it was a big deal. The things that were in Nubian Notion, posters, stickers, images of people that look like us, particularly Jim Kelly from Enter the Dragon. You know, I would like to leave your island. Oh, man, everyone loved that. So again, the superhero thing I was caught up in that a lot. So it influenced me a lot that I loved the mural, and I was heartbroken when it was painted over and there was nothing to tell him that was being painted over. It was just like it was a done deal. Same thing with Ricardo's piece on Nelson Mandela. Mm-hmm. And it stayed with me for the longest time, the lack of respect. Now, I understand maybe the business was whatever, but there should have been, at the very least, a massive print, life-size print of that they could have given to Dana to say thank you. They should have definitely done it for Ricardo. Mm-hmm. And just to at least say, we have this preserved for you. Mm-hmm. I find it really offensive when beautiful works of art just get glossed over because we got to move on and we're gentrification and we're doing whatever. It's almost an insult because it had so much impact on me as a kid. Same thing with the other piece he had done that's near Grove Hall. So flash forward many years later, the MECO program at the high school I teach at, Lincoln Sudbury, they hired a great friend of mine, a wonderful artist named Thomas Quest Burns, to do a mural to support the MECO students. And he started it off with the hotel that's right around the corner from the main hotel down Dudley. It's now Nubian Square, but it used to be all down Dudley. The hotel there, on one end of the mural is Roslindale with the giant clock near Forest Hills. On the other is John Wilson's Eternal Presence, which I have a story for that too. And some other things. So it represents these different neighborhoods. So on the side of one of the buildings that's across the street from the hotel there, he said, I don't know what to put there. I'm going to leave it up to you. And I said, I'm going to repaint that. And so I repainted. It's horizontal, but I repainted Dana Chandler's mural. So it's permanently hanging up in this suburban school out in Lincoln Sudbury that you're going to need a cherry picker. You will need a cherry picker if you want to take it down. Because I was like, we're going to elevate that so it's permanently there. And I said, I hope with my students that it makes them feel the way it made me feel as a child. So it's an honor and a blessing how much that piece just did so much for me creatively. Color, composition, visual, looking cool. Just the whole looking cool thing. So it stayed with me. It's been with me my entire life.
It's incredible.
In some way, shape, or form. It has been with me. When I went to college, I, like Rob Stowe's dream of, like so many of us, wanting to be illustrators, comic artists, and what have you, I would think, I went to Boston University, that, I would end up possibly illustrating some of these superheroes, these characters and stuff. And then I had a professor named Floyd Barber, who I took Afro-American history and Afro-American literature with. And Trisha Rose, who had me, I took a class with her on women's issues, women, feminism, and women's stories. And what it did for me is it made me say, you know something, there are far more interesting human beings that have existed than Batman and Superman. And I want to deep dive and explore those people's lives, and it's much more compelling. So Josephine Baker, you know, Paul Robeson, Mass 54th, Tuskegee Airmen. I mean, the list goes on and on. No matter what people do to try to whitewash and wipe them out, for me, I'm like, oh, while you're wiping them out, I'm drawing them over here. I'm sculpting them, I'm painting them over here. And I attribute that to Dana as well. Once I knew the meaning of the murals and stuff as a kid, it's always been in the back of my mind, we're beautiful people and we have some great stories to share, and I'm honored to be one of the people that represents it in my work. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. So now I want to have a chance to look at your works individually and kind of like in a different context. And Reggie, you have such a rich and fascinating history, starting off in the late 1960s at Yale, studying with Walker Evans and as a co-founder of the Black Workshop there, and then not too soon after that, traveling around Africa, taking pictures of pretty much everything, like starting your life in earnest as a documentarian, and then back in Boston later on, making wonderful works like this, which is in the exhibition, when you're walking around the city with Alan Rohan Crite as he's making his illustrations of sites of Black renown in the city. You're taking photographs of them and later overlaying them with things like the ceremonial mask from Benin. That's here. So I wanted to just give you a moment to kind of reflect on the evolution of your practice as a photographer from where you began to where you find yourself now, doing all different kinds of projects, with, as we heard, taking tens of thousands of photographs, and how you see your trajectory, and if that was kind of complemented or informed in any way by your relationship to the program at different moments.
Well, it's kind of hard to know where to start with all that. I should say that early on in my academic life, I thought that graphic arts and printing was something that I really was attracted to and felt that I should explore, and eventually realized that I needed to branch out a little more than that in design, and ended up in art school, and from art school into graphic design. And the graphic design program at Yale in the 60s was quite an interesting place, because in that building, the Art and Architecture building there, we had the good fortune to connect with a group of architects and city planners who realized that the way architecture and city planning was being taught was really fraught with a lot of issues that didn't relate to community and to how one lives as a citizen in the development of the spaces that were being designed. And my education just kind of pivoted at that point when I realized that the tools that I had acquired and began to deal with really needed to have a context, one that would really make a difference in how we relate. And so the group of young architects, planners, and so forth began to alter curriculum. And we began to look at how we could be a force to change the curriculum in the graduate school. And I saw that as an opportunity to begin to document and to use the camera to be able to photograph as well as to make film and videotape a part of my repertoire. And so I was blessed to have people like Walker Evans, John T. Hill, and Tom Brown, Murray Lerner, and eventually when I got to Boston, I was able to use those tools in a much more constructive manner. So the Black Workshop was founded in 1968. It was one of the members as their graphic designer among all these architects, people like Don Stahl, who was in practice here in Boston, was brought in to try to tame us a bit. And Don, of course, said, well, I've got to practice in Boston, and I'm not going to, take on the School of Architecture. But he was very instrumental in helping us understand, how we could be more responsive to needs of the community. And so during that time, I took on the work of documenting the explosive beginnings of the Black Workshop, which went on for about 10 years after we left. And so as I passed through all that, I began to see that my role could be one who could document what was going on. The Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C., I was able to take my leave from the university and spend time in D.C. Documenting. We were involved in Newark, New Jersey, one of the first school daycare complexes in the country, which I documented in film as well as in still photography. So I had the opportunity to use those tools that I had acquired. And to this day, that's one of the major pieces that keeps me moving. And so years later on, as I got into experiencing West Africa and looking at cross-cultural influences and how we could see vestiges of the culture that we experienced in Africa, particularly West Africa and Ghana, right here in the U.S. That became one of the stronger pieces, and a lot of the projects kind of connected with that notion that we need to look at the connectedness of our experience, throughout the diaspora. So this piece that you're looking at was something that I created when I worked with, actually Alan Cricht was my mentor very shortly after I arrived in Boston. And so I was able to go through the community with him and be able to document a lot of the institutions that existed in Lower Roxbury in the Black community, as well as Beacon Hill. And so we're looking at the African Meeting House, which is superimposed over by the Benin ceremonial pendant, which I experienced at Festac in 1977, and was later commissioned to do this piece for the centennial here in Boston. So it was a very kind of rich time for me to be able to have mentors and to also learn how to teach photography and try to stay ahead of my students by a few weeks as we looked at experimental photography and large format photography and so forth. So I had the opportunity to do that here in Boston, and certainly AAMARP was was a major force in all that. When you saw people or were around people like John Wilson, and as earlier was mentioned, Nelson Stevens, and travel throughout the National Conference of Artists Network. They were artists that I would have never had the opportunity to experience. And so I'm very grateful that I landed in Boston. Sometimes I wondered, but the experience has been very rich and continues to today. You know, I'm very, very moved by the company in which I keep. The artists at AAMARP have been amazing. I'm always learning. School's in every day for me. And the work that has come out of that gives me hope that as artists, we have the opportunity to do what art should do, and that is to be the balm and a cure for some of the trauma that we experience in our lives, and that's been passed on. And so it's a real honor and privilege to be able to continue to work. Currently, I'm working on a documentary called A Peculiar Freedom, which deals with free blacks in New England from 1750 to 1900. We're looking at 5 individuals, and we're hoping to be able to do a 2-part series, which we're pitching to different outlets at this point. We have a proof of concept piece, which we've created, that deals with Harriet Wilson, who was the first woman of African descent to publish a novel. We're also dealing with Robert Morris, who was the second to be admitted to the bar. We're looking at Lucy Terry Prince, first known poem that was presented in the western part of the state, and then later Guilford, Vermont. And we're looking at Martin Freeman, who was the first African American to be a college president, who later migrated to Liberia to be a college president there. So the trajectory has been quite amazing in terms of the places that it has taken me. And being here in Boston with AAMARP and looking forward to our 50th anniversary next year is something that we're really quite proud of and looking forward to celebrating. And it hasn't really been announced yet, but we do know that the city of Boston has said that on April 7th, it will be AAMARP Day as well as Dana Chandler Day in Boston. So I'm really pleased. So there's a lot going on.
And the program is running long, and I want to have everyone get the opportunity to talk to you in person and ask questions that they have. So let's just try to move through the last couple of questions somewhat quickly if we can. But Lemerci, I've known your work in narrative quilts for so long and have been in love with them and so many aspects of the way that you work so uniquely with all different kinds of materials. But I was really excited to learn from talking to you and researching your work that you actually started off doing metalwork and making jewelry. And so when you shared with me this piece that you made in 1995, part of a residency that you had in Brazil, and I saw that it had your metalwork and your jewelry in this beautiful devotional sculpture that also included your poetry and a quote from Mel King and so many other like elements that seemed to draw so many different aspects of your work together. I knew that we had to include it, so I was hoping you could just say briefly, sorry, a little bit about your trajectory from doing metalwork, making jewelry, and then these devotional sculptures to how you arrived at working with textiles.
Well, my creative manifesto is I remember, reclaim, restore, and reimagine. And so that covers my approach to any medium that I'm working in. And it encompasses the idea of the reclaiming of space that has been questionable, that has been denied, that has been a part of our journey. And so my quest in going to Brazil was to see the pejorative effects of Afro-Brazilian claim and the presence of Africanisms in Brazil. And along the way of being there for about 6 months, I began to understand more about the syncretization of Catholicism and the African religions of Candomblé, and looked at them as ways that we contemporarily could apply to our own present existence. One in this particular shrine is the house of Ogun, and he is syncretized with the Catholic Saint Michael, the warrior. And Ogun's implements of war become those of farming and eventually love. And so this idea that our children in our society are turning in on each other and violence is a part of the issues that they face for survival. I wanted to dedicate this shrine to that survival, to that reckoning with war and violence not being our way of being human. And so with this shrine, I took on what is associated as an image or a mask of Ogun to speak to the creation of a knife in his face that would help to give that mask power. So it is about the power of that. And I discussed this with Mel King. I had the opportunity and privilege of doing that. And the quote that you see in the box is directly from him as an activist and a warrior, and his concern for the youth in this community. And all youth, as a matter of fact. So it's dedicated to the salvation of our youth, and many of whom in the city I've had the privilege to work with and see the genius that they represent, only if given a chance. And so it is my privilege to try to help pass a baton, if that's possible, to enliven the spaces that we have in Boston with their rich energy. And so this idea that was presented to me in Brazil of the house, or the house is owned by a particular deity. The house of Ogun is where I was taken to a compound to see. The house of Oxumare, the house of the patron saint of Brazil, Yemaya. All of these are represented as a living space even. So in the living of this becomes this extraordinary power to be able to overcome what are obstacles and challenges. And so that's where this actually rests. In my legacy that I've gained from my mother and my grandfather was a tailor, and my mother walked in his shoes as a needle worker, and she was also a beater. So those things were in my family as a part of making. And as I began to encounter different mediums, fiber is my favorite because it is the familiarity of the cloth that we have from birth to death. The familiarity of the cloth, that's a common universal language. And as a matter of fact, I believe that not only is art document, but in fiber, you have the opportunity to create visual text, visual language that you can see that is applicable for many circumstances. But in my work, I am bringing up hidden histories and representation of people who may not be necessarily discussed, who are extraordinary, ordinary in life, but extraordinary in their contributions. And so this fiber language as text becomes an anchor in my work and is expressed in metals and in sculptural form. I currently have a sculpture that will be dedicated very soon that is in Roxbury on the first fire station built in Roxbury in 30 years. That is 3 layers, as my work is layered in fiber. It's 3 layers of stainless steel, perforated stainless steel. And so when you look at the layer of the fireman, the layer of the community, and the layer of the built environment, you see this kind of moire fiber effect happening. So light as a part of my work in fiber has come about with my study of holography and the producing of holograms. And that all of that is to say that it's like one life work in the area of remember the memory, the activity, the crossing through the middle passage, the reclaim of space that we do, and the opportunity to reimagine what these spaces are. In a current project that I'm in called with my beloved partner, Hakeem Rakib, on Monument by the city of Boston. It's called Love Letters to Malcolm. We are using innovative apparatus in augmented reality to bring people to sites with barcodes of 6 sites of Malcolm X's footprint in Boston that led to his trajectory of global presence. And so we will be launching that project also very soon. But it's all, as far as I'm concerned, one voice.
And Shea, to close, I wanted to ask you to maybe reflect a little bit on your incredible Scrolls of Justice project that you've been working on for a very long time, and which, as you say, is now 2 miles in length. This incredible document, this diaristic approach to art making that you've been working since just after 9/11, when the U.S. first invaded Afghanistan, up until today, I'm sure. Yeah. But this really intense, beautiful admixture of drawings and collages and stream of consciousness writing, of which we could only include a very small excerpt in the show. But one of the things that I really loved about the excerpt that we included is the extent to which in this piece you can come to terms with how incredible of a draftsman you are. I think that the drawings are so beautifully made that there is such a kind of like humanizing quality to your hand, even if you are depicting someone that you may loathe otherwise, that nevertheless you find beauty in this kind of like, the stream of consciousness with which you see history living in the present. So I wanted to just ask you to kind of reflect these many years later about that project, how it came about, how it's changed? Does it gain in political urgency? Is there a newness to it? Or actually it's just like that it kind of deals with the extent to which some things like anti-Blackness exist on a continuum in this country?
Okay. I'll start with my time as an undergrad at Boston University. They gave me a rubric of stuff to buy, and if you go to college in some places, a lot of times the stuff you buy you never use while you're in school. It's the whim of the professor. So I had some scrolls with me for years, and I didn't know what to do with them. As the war was building, or as there was a build-up to the war in Afghanistan, at the high school I was teaching at, Lincoln Sudbury, at that time period, there were some conservative kids that were there and some conservative adults who were pro-American, and this was during the time of if you're not with us, you're against us, under Bush. We don't have French fries, we have freedom fries. Let's remember the rhetoric from back then. So I had an older student come up to me and he said, "Mr. Justice, you seem kind of liberal, even though I teach art and I don't particularly talk about politics except during lunch if kids want to ask questions." He said, "Are you pro-American or are you kind of pro-Saddam?" I'm going to always remember this as long as I live. And I said, "I'll tell you what, I'll take some notes and when the war is over, I'll give you my opinion." What I didn't know is it would be the longest war in American history. And that one roll turned into 2 to 5 to 10 to a 30-pounder to where I'm at now. When I was in graduate school, it became my thesis project back in 2012, so I had to find a way. I couldn't display it because Lesley University is too small in terms of the length. So a great friend of mine's, Lee Weinstein, right there in the front row, created a program where we took hundreds and hundreds of photos of a year's worth when this guy ran for president who talked about hope and change. So we took hundreds of photos of it, and Lee created a program to stitch it together so you don't see any breaks, so it looks like you're watching a video of the scroll just going across. I've worked on it for several years. The larger role I worked on, and my mom had a great idea years ago. She had said to me, because I reference a lot of pop culture in addition to political stuff that's happening, because it's a continuous timeline. And sometimes I take deviations and detours to look back on history, which is the one that you see there, right? I like to do past as prologue. What does now have to do with then? Which you'll see in the 2 frame pieces up there. So my mother had said to me, "Wow, you have this person, that person on there. Wouldn't it be really cool if you can get them to sign it? Because if you get them to sign it, it might be worth some more money. So you might sell it." So my best friend, Joseph Jones, and I, we've been to tons of comic book conventions and situations where we've had to roll it up and special carry it and bring it to places to get people to sign it. So I was lucky enough to get Governor Deval Patrick signed it. City Councilor Tito Jackson signed it. He's a good friend, so he was really enthusiastic about signing it. Faith Reingold signed it. William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, Nichelle Nichols from Star Trek, Lee Majors and Lindsay Wagner, the Bionic Man and the Bionic Woman signed it. Oh, I took it to places where you'd go, "Really? Comic? You got them?" And then I only had one person reject me from signing it, and that was former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. I went to she was signing her autobiography at the John F. Kennedy Library, and when I went there, I had this thing, and I was like, I bought a copy of her book just so she's not insulted. So I brought a copy of her book, and when she signed the book, I said, "I'd be honored if you signed this thing over here." So she said, "Oh, no, I'm not signing anything other than my autobiography." I said, "Well, let me explain it." So, no, and her guards kind of were like, "No, we're not signing anything. This might be terrorism." So I get mad, and I'm out in the lobby, and I'm like, I hope she loses her credentials in foreign policy now. I'm pissed. So now I'm getting mad over it. Of course, people are looking at me like, "What's wrong? What's he talking about?" And I ended up getting into a conversation with this guy and his wife, and I got him to look it over and check it out. And the guy I was talking to at the time, it took me a minute, and I'm like, oh my God, it was Michael Dukakis. So he was kind of like, I'd like to look at it. And for some, I said probably one of the dumbest things I wish I hadn't said to him. And I don't know if he took it the wrong way, but I just remember saying, in spite of the tank, I still voted for you. And I was like, why did I say that to him? But it didn't bother him. But now talking about it now, I'm like, why did I say that to him? So I've brought it to different places and had different people sign it. The challenge when I was in graduate school, when I gave my presentation, was about solutions. Because I said, you have a lot of questions and you ask all these things. I'm in a group show at the museum over with Barry Gaither about cancel violence. And part of it was you had one piece that's supposed to be bringing up problems and issues and challenges, and one with solutions. And what I've always been stuck on is, how do you come up with a solution when the problems are so deep? So, for instance, when it comes to canceling violence, people say, well, if you say canceling violence and it's an urban situation or what have you, it means guns. So we got to do something about canceling violence. I said, well, we could talk about places that sell liquor in a lot of neighborhoods, and vaping products, or environmental racism that poisons our systems, or things that don't give us support when it comes to issues of prenatal care. So I'm like, there's a lot of ways we can define the word violence. So I get so caught up in trying to understand the problem that the solution starts getting further and further away, but I'm like, I got to deep dive to find the problems. So this piece here, Roger Taney, if those that don't know, the Dred Scott decision, Supreme Court Justice, who said, the Negro has no rights, a white man is bound to respect, and it contributed to the creation of the Civil War. Because this was like really a thing here. So I ended up adding images, particularly George Stinney, Dred Scott, and young man Trayvon Martin, young people who have been murdered by law enforcement and did not receive justice. So I'm like, does it matter now? Everything that's spelled out in the Constitution, got obsessive about reading the Constitution, but saying, these are the things that's said, but these are the things that are happening. And unfortunately, right now, we're living in a time where, the Supreme Court is pretty much cherry picking which aspects of the Constitution as actually legitimate and real. And I'm someone who wants to be there to say, this is what it was, this is a precedent of what it's been, and now you're saying, let's just chuck it all away and let's start from scratch, or let's roll it back to pre-1950 America and things like that. So I want to be there to illustrate it because it's necessary to have truth tellers. Dana inspired that out of me. Thomas Nast, political illustrator from the 1800s, inspired out of me. There's a lot of people, and I enjoy the process of truth to power. So the most recent thing I started to do was a piece where I collaged it, I had submitted, but again, it was too large for the thing because it's like 50 feet or what have you. But I started I'd been to several different organizations, Wake Up the Earth Festival, political activist groups to support immigrants, different libraries around the city, and the one thing they had in common to help me understand possible solutions were flyers, brochures, and paperwork that have QR codes on them. Now, what I didn't know until I had a conversation with people was how easy QR codes can be transferred and used and all this. So on the much larger submission I put in for the show, I included QR codes from different organizations and stuff like that. So if you want to go in this thing, I can't come up with the answers for something like this or for solutions, but I have references of places or people or organizations that might. And so that's where I've been, like, this might be the solution I was looking for. If we're going to solve a lot of these issues, it has to be done as a collective. If I was in graduate school, I'd be like, yes, I got it now. But at the time, I was like, I'm still deep diving and doing the research. And the other piece up there on the right is Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells Barnett. I've always had a lot of respect for Frederick Douglass. I'm still surprised Hollywood's never made a movie of his life. And if they did, they'd probably screw it up anyways. But Ida B. Wells, there's something about the fact that she risked her life to write and document hangings and lynchings and the reasons why and the things like that, that I always look at the Constitution as something that has so much potential if people actually read it, understood it, and appreciated it, and said when it says we the people, it means everything. And I got to be honest with you, I started developing these kinds of feelings not recently, but probably when I was a kid watching those infomercials called Schoolhouse Rock. That's what got me interested. And when I was a little boy visiting my grandparents in Harrisonburg, Virginia, they were antique collectors, and when you went to my grandmother's house, when you first walk in, they had this display box that you could turn sideways, and it had all these political buttons in them, because my grandfather used to collect political buttons. So imagine being 5 years old and learning how to pronounce Spiro T. Agnew, Richard Milhouse, and learning all these names and just going, I know how to say, Gerald Rudolph Ford, And so it always stayed with me looking at these things and studying it. And I've talked to some of my cousins about it, and they go, oh yeah, I remember that. And I was like, yeah, it was just something I was fascinated about. So like with Dana's mural, if I look at it and I pay attention to it and I kind of study it and I get fascinated by it, I want to do something to complement it or be a part of it in some way. So as I work on this, I would have thought at a certain point when Joe Biden pulled the U.S. out of Afghanistan, I continued on it only in the concept of we're going to probably start getting more truth, because usually the first casualty of war is truth. So I'm like eagerly waiting for books from John Meacham and Doris Kearns and all these different people. I'm waiting for the book. And then the Trump thing came in. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to need some more paper now. A lot more paper. So instead of it being possibly close to 2 miles, by the time I'm done, we could roll it out and it'll be right on the steps of Washington, D.C. by the time it's done. That's where this is going. So it's a blessing, it's an honor to do it and really focus and try to understand things. And I'm obsessive about fact-checking myself and not getting too biased in it. I had a wonderful conversation with someone who a celebrity I had met who reminded me of why, how much I miss my grandfather. And that was this guy, he was a former professional wrestler, champ in the 60s, Bruno Sammartino. And I got him to sign it because I drew him on there when I was reminiscing about my grandfather and politics and stereotypes of wrestling and all this other stuff that I included. And just the conversation we had about his life during World War II, when he was living in Abruzzi, Italy, and he had to hide out, and he took up weightlifting, and he ends up being this world champion wrestler. And I'm talking to him like he's just another person that has these experiences, ethnicity, discrimination, World War II, and all this other stuff. And I was like, wow, I wish my grandfather were here for this. Because my family just loved wrestling back in the day. So those are the things that matter so much to me, and just getting the history, because no matter how ugly, painful, and rotten, and awful certain things have happened to target groups in the country and individuals and things like that, I don't want to ignore it, because they deserve better, particularly as descendants of folks who were slaves and what have you, and Jim Crow and all these other things that have happened. I don't want to let it go, because I'm standing on those shoulders, arm in arm with them. So for me, it's an honor and a blessing to tell those stories or find ways to include those stories in my work.
That's incredible. Thank you so much. You want to say something?
I just want to give a shout out to the institutions that have allowed this master of arts collective to display its work and give onus to our home, which is the Museum of the National Center of African American Artists, and its director, former director who is just retired, Edmund Barry Gaither. Elma Lewis, and the lifting of all of those people who believed that we could do it. And now the embrace of the institution of the ICA and your work. Thank you so much for the research that you've done and your dedication to making this a fantastic exhibition. And to all of those artists who are in AAMARP now, the brilliance the paintings of Brian McFarlane, the opportunity to see Khalid Cody's work, the photographs that keep growing of Hakeem Rakib, and the works of Susan Thompson and Gloretta Baines. And I know I'm leaving people out, but this is such a great privilege to be able to walk the journey of the earth with people who are creative, who are makers, and who make our world better. So I just wanted to say out of this conversation that I hope the voice of our community is reflected in our works, and that the onus of our collective being lifted by this community is extraordinary. So thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for your incredible generosity. I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to ask questions that they might have that we didn't get to from the audience. And if you haven't seen the show yet, the galleries are open until 9. We have catalogs available over here if you'd like to purchase one. And thank you so much for being here with us. It's a tremendous honor to share the stage with these folks.
Can I just say one thing?
Sure.
If there are any AAMARP artists in the audience, would you please stand so folks can see you?
Well, thank you all so much. Please come join us on the stage for some food and drinks and more conversation.